So let's, before I start my presentation, let's just talk about the next one that's coming up, which will be November 13th. And Carol Whittier will be doing another talk on food, which is always interesting and always mighty tasty. So I recommend you coming. So we're also, Carl and I, Carol, are putting together next year's schedule. And we already have a few people that have submitted stuff. But if you have something that you think might be of general interest to people, let us know. Just put out a brief description and a paragraph or two and a title and send it out to us so we can take a look at it. So that's basically all I have to say about that. And tonight we're going to talk about the USS Kearsarge. The most famous ship of the Civil War that nobody's ever heard of. It was built at the Portsmouth Navy Yard. And just to make things clear, in case anybody here from Maine, the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard is actually in Maine. Every once in a while, New Hampshire thinks that they want to abscond with it. It goes to the Supreme Court and they get shut down every time. So this is the pride of Portsmouth, the ship that rivaled the USS Constitution in fame, and embodies the essence of New England naval history. What is this, not going to work now? Okay. All right, what's going on?
I don't know.
It was working before.
It's all plugged in and ready to go.
You might not have context on the PowerPoint itself.
What's that?
I'm saying on Scott's screen, context might not be
I
set.
can't have car.
Hold on.
Take it out, put it
Are
back
there
in.
any teenagers in the house?
Try it again.
Okay, all right. So, what do we know about the Civil War Navy? If you remember back from maybe high school history, and one of the things that might come to mind about the Civil War Navy is the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. That epic battle which occurred on March 9th, 1862, with two ironclad ships that faced off in Hampton Roads, Virginia. And they fired at each other for hours, and neither one of them could damage the other. But navies around the world made note, and they said, this is the end of wooden warships. They still existed during the Civil War, but basically it set all of that in motion. So who were what do you know about the Civil War Navy? In the Army, the number of men who served in the Union Army, throughout the war, the 4-year time people, not all at one time, was over 2 million men. 2 million men served in the Army. And the Navy, on the other hand, is 84,000. The total number of Union deaths in the Civil War, 300,000. In the Navy, it was 1,800. The Civil War Navy, I think it's important, even though before we get into talking actually about the Kearsarge, to talk a little bit about naval operations in the Civil War. What was the Navy put charge to do? And basically, they had three theaters of operation. One of those was blockade duty, and then the second one was war on the western rivers, and then controlling Confederate commerce destroyers on the high seas. And that's the last one. That's what the Kearsarge was involved in. So the Anaconda Plan, this is the naval blockade. It was actually proposed by General William Scott, who was an Army officer. But basically it was to strangle the South, to shut it off from all the goods, which the Confederacy, much of which, because they had very limited mechanical and industrial resources, they got a lot of their stuff from Europe, especially England. By the end of 1862, the blockade had become so effective that the total amount of cotton exported was only 13,000 bales as compared to 2 million bales in the previous year. So some of the earliest Union victories of the war were a result of the actions by the U.S. Navy. This was the theater of operation on the rivers, especially the Mississippi River and all the rivers that fed into it. So fall in New Orleans, April 28, 1862. This is the largest, New Orleans was the largest city in the Confederacy, not Richmond, not Atlanta. And the loss of this city was not only of strategic importance, but it was a demoralizing blow to the Confederacy. Another one was the U.S. Navy maintained control of the naval base at Pensacola, Florida. And this was strategically important because it gave the Navy a coaling station, a refueling station for down in the blockading squadron in the Gulf Coast, which they desperately needed. And they maintained and they defended and maintained that naval base at Pensacola throughout the war. It was a combined Army-Navy amphibious operation in 1862 that on the outer banks of North Carolina that captured New Bern and Port Royal, and they were retained throughout the war. This again allowed the Navy to use those places as refueling and resupply bases for the blockading fleet. A combined Army and Navy operation resulted in the fall of Vicksburg on July 4th, 1863. By the way, Vicksburg, Mississippi did not celebrate the 4th of July until World War II, after Vicksburg fell. So the Union Navy now has total control of the Mississippi, and they can deny the Confederacy being able to move goods and resources and men and equipment up and down the Mississippi. As Lincoln put it, the father waters flows unvexed to the sea. Controlling Confederate commerce destroyers on the high seas. That's the role of the Kearsarge. So Confederate commerce destroyers such as the Shenandoah, the Florida, Stonewall, and Alabama wreak havoc with northern shipping, destroying them. Let's now talk a little bit, so now that you've got a little bit of an idea of what the Navy was responsible for in the Civil War, let's talk about the men of the Civil War, the demographics of who were Civil War sailors. So, Civil War sailors actually shared little in common with the men who joined the Army. 78% of them came from 3 eastern states: Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania. And whereas farmers comprised the majority of the men in the Army, the majority of these men were urban dwellers. They were artisans, laborers, and such. And you would seldom find a farm boy joining the Navy. They did, but it was very rare. Civil War sailors, the ultimate pragmatists. The men who would be sailors tended to join for practical reasons rather than a lofty attitude of patriotism. They viewed life in the Navy as less fraught with danger, constant marching, poor food, and miserable living conditions. And they were right. So this is a great picture because it shows a typical warship. I think it's the USS Miami, but I'm not sure. But there's several things to note in here. First of all, there's African Americans in here. There's a group of them right here. They appear to be either mending clothes or making clothes, which is a pastime aboard ship. There are Marines on board this ship. There's one here. There's another one back here with a banjo in his hand. And all the rest of these men, look, this guy could care less if the photographer's there or not. And what we have here in the back is an officer looking rather aloof at the enlisted men displayed before him. 19th century societal attitudes exhibit a tendency to look down on sailors as the poorest dregs of society. They were marginalized. Northerners viewed sailors as hapless and godless set of men whose poor state of affairs had either sprung from wretched beginnings or resulted from lives made miserable by excessive drinking, careless spending, or that. Because sailors were considered coarse, brutal, and loud. Some officers considered them to be rough rubbish or in off-scourings. They could be recruited. They were a contrast in age. Ship's boys could be recruited as young as 14 years old, and this lad right here is definitely a very young boy, and so is this one here. they're used in combat. They perform many duties aboard ship, but in combat they were used as powder monkeys. As being young and agile, they could quickly run powder from the magazines to the guns. Admiral Farragut himself, who was not an enlisted man, he entered the naval service as a midshipman at age 10. And by the time of the Civil War, he was 60 years old, and he spent 50 years in the Navy. That's a mind-boggling statistic. Absolutely mind-boggling, especially in the age of sail, which was a very hard life aboard ship in that time period. Who were these sailors? I just put together this little montage of photographs showing various sailors. It's estimated that only a third of the men who served in the Navy during the Civil War had any maritime experience. But the Navy revered these old salts and the years of experience they had and their capacity to teach landsmen the ropes. Herman Melville, this is what he said about the Navy. It's the asylum for the perverse, the home of the unfortunate. Here these sons of adversity meet the children of calamity, and the children of calamity meet the offspring of sin. And Herman Melville knew what he was talking about, because Herman Melville shipped aboard the whaling ship Acushnet from New Bedford in the 1840s, and he deserted that ship in the Marquesas. If I remember from my reading, and I haven't read this for a while, I think it was because of the cruelty of the captain. So he was basically, he self-marooned himself in these islands in the Marquesas. And he spent several months there, experienced dalliance with the promiscuous native girls. And when he got out of the Navy, excuse me, let me just backtrack there for a minute. So Herman Melville said, how am I going to get out of here? So it turned out that another whaling ship showed up in the Marquesas where he was, and he hopped a ride to Hawaii. And so now he's in Hawaii, and he's closer to major ship trade routes. Who shows up there? The USS United States. And Melville says, aha, now I can get home. So he shipped aboard the USS United States and ended up back in America. And so he started off on his career writing several things, including Moby Dick, of course, which everybody probably knows about, but also Typee and Umu. Those were his experiences in the Marquesas. The Confidence Man, Redburn, and White Jacket, or The World and a Man of War. And he gives one of the most detailed descriptions of every single rate and every single, what they did aboard ship and how the ship was run and all of that. And it is a fascinating read. And I think it's even more fascinating than Moby Dick, actually, but that's because I'm interested in the Navy. Oh, by the way, Herman Melville was very much involved in societal improvements. And so he was responsible for getting the Navy to finally, this is when he was a civilian, of course, after he left, getting the Navy to abolish flogging, which happened in the 1850s. Herman Melville never experienced flogging himself, but he witnessed it on many occasions, both aboard whaling ships, which they did, they flogged the sailors, and of course on the naval ships as well. So he was responsible for getting flogging abolished in the Navy. There were many African Americans who served in the Navy. Some 15%, some accounts you read say it was as high as 20%. Many of these, at least 14 of the crew on the Kearsarge were African Americans, including Joaquin Pease, who was awarded the Medal of Honor. So, just kind of like in summary, Civil War sailor, he's something of an enigma, a cynical pragmatist, crude, boisterous. He's a complex three-dimensional character who can still elicit a measure of sympathetic admiration. Officers came from higher levels of American society. They received their appointments as midshipmen, or after 1845, to the Naval Academy through family connections. This image over here is Captain Winslow and his officers on the USS Kearsarge. Oops. So the Kearsarge, a Mohican-class sloop of war, best known for defeating the commerce-rated CSS Alabama, built at Portsmouth Navy Yard, and launched in September of 1861. She was sponsored by Mrs. McFarland, the wife of the editor of Concord State. And keep that name, McFarland, in mind, because it'll come up again at the end of this presentation. John Anthony Winslow, he was actually born in North Carolina, but he's from New England. The Winslows, Plymouth, Mayflower, yeah, he's one of those. James Thornton, he was from Merrimack, New Hampshire. He served as the executive officer on the Kearsarge during the fight. Thornton, this is Thornton's grave in Reed's Ferry Cemetery in Merrimack. Here's a sum of the crew of the USS Kearsarge. 50% of the sailors on the Kearsarge, when they left for their cruise from Portsmouth Navy Yard, were from New England, notably New Hampshire, Maine, and Massachusetts. The balance were from a number of other states, mostly New York and Pennsylvania. When they got to European cities, they recruited a number of foreign-born sailors to make up for the shortages. Whoops. The captain of the Kearsarge, the first captain, was a man by the name of Charles Pickering of Portsmouth. And he spent his life in the Navy, appointed midshipman at the age of 6, if you can remember that. He turned over the Kearsarge to Winslow on April 8, 1863, when the ship was over in the Azores. He would have the dubious distinction of being the captain of the first warship, the USS Housatonic, sunk by a submarine, CSS Hunley, in Charleston Harbor in 1864. Finally, whoops, 2 days out from Portsmouth, the Kearsarge entered the Gulf Stream and encountered a storm that was for many their first experience. The Kearsarge bounced around, pitching and rolling. Heavy seas filled the boats and damaged the ship's cutter. Even the most experienced hands felt dreadfully sick. Pickering himself was not immune, as were most of his officers. Despite the seasickness, the men still had to stand their watches. They still had to do their duty. The ship and men endured this for an additional 3 days. Many sailors thought the ship would sink, but they were so sick they didn't care. Finally, the storm abated, and Captain Pickering ordered a spirit ration. Now, some people think that the Navy, that's the official term for the spirit ration aboard ship. Not a grog ration, it's a spirit ration. It was served twice a day, at noon and at 4 p.m. So, when Pickering ordered the spirit ration, most of the crew queued up, including the ship's boys. So, Ezra Bartlett, who was one of the officers, he watched in fascination as boys of 12 and 15 swallowed the warm draft with no more of a change of expression than the oldest salts. So, the spirit ration, just in case you're interested, is a half a gill combined with half a gill of water. This is a half a gill. So that would be a half a gill of alcohol. Now it used to be rum, and it was in the British Navy for a long period of time. It was in the American Navy too, until all those big farms out in the Midwest started overproducing all of those grains. And so whiskey all of a sudden became really, really cheap. So it reverted to whiskey. But that was what the spirit ration was in the Navy, certainly by the time of the Civil War. So this spirit ration was a half a gill of spirits, a half a gill of water, twice a day. Now this is a very interesting, I don't know if you can see it all that well. This is a sketch from a sketchbook of Charles Ellery Stedman, and he was a surgeon aboard the USS Pawnee, and he was a very good artist. So here you have, if you can see it, here you have all the sailors lined up. They're taking their spirit ration dispensed from a tub. Here's one, he's downing his spirit ration. And this is all witnessed by officers, which this whole spirit ration was a very organized situation. People didn't just take a spirit ration and walk away. So sometimes, the reason why it was observed by commissioned officers was because some sailors would take the swallow, walk away, and find some place aboard ship where they'd secreted another container, and they'd spit it out. And the next time they had a spirit ration, they'd do the same thing, and maybe for 2 or 3 times, and then they'd go back and drink it all at once. So what the officers were there for was to make sure that that didn't happen. So after the sailor had downed his spirit ration, the officer would ask him a question: who's the President of the United States? So if he had a mouthful of spirit, he couldn't answer, so he had to swallow it. The other thing was he'd take his cup, turn it upside down to show that it was empty. The CSS Alabama. This vessel was built in Birkenhead on the River Mersey, opposite Liverpool, England, by John Laird Sons and Company. In its entire career, the Alabama never visited a Confederate port. Keep in mind the fact that this ship was built in the UK, in England. We'll talk about that later. It was a screw sloop of war, just like the Kearsarge, and its captain was Raphael Semmes. And he was a successful commerce raider, too successful. That's why the Federal Navy was after him, to destroy his ship. He captured and destroyed 65 Union merchant and naval ships, mostly merchant ships, only one naval ship, in the North Atlantic. All of the CSS Alabama's officers were from the southern states of the Confederacy. Almost all of the enlisted men of the Alabama, in contrast to the Kearsarge, were English, mostly from Liverpool. In her 2-year career, the CSS Alabama destroyed 65 Union merchant ships. And the chase of the Kearsarge after the Alabama was a long game of cat and mouse. 2 years, the Kearsarge searched the seas, mostly Atlantic, off the coast of France, Spain, the Azores, and Great Britain, where the Alabama looked for prey. And the Alabama always seemed to be one step ahead of him. So these are some of the ports that the Kearsarge called on in Europe. Austin, Queenstown, Ushant, Flushing, Dover. And this sounds like a travelogue. Sounds like it would be a great place. The best thing for this was that these frequent ports of call gave an opportunity for the sailors to be able to get fresh fruit and fresh vegetables and even fresh meat. The purser was busy with his mates. He was ashore, and he was able to purchase stuff and bring it aboard ship. And that's what the sailors were preparing for their meals aboard ship. They didn't have to eat their hardtack or their salt pork until they ran out of the fresh food. So, after searching for the Alabama for 2 years, Winslow, and so the other reason why these frequent port of calls was because Winslow had access to messages from envoys scattered throughout these cities and other places in Europe. And he could get a telegram saying, oh, the Kearsarge is here. It was here on last week. Don't know where it's going. So Winslow got an idea where to start looking for it. Finally, June of 1864, Winslow received a telegram from the U.S. envoy in Cherbourg that the Alabama was in the port of Cherbourg. The Kearsarge was then in Flushing and not far away. Winslow immediately recalled the crew, got steam up, and headed for Cherbourg. The Alabama arrived at Cherbourg to find that the Alabama was still in port. While the ship steamed back and forth, Winslow had them drill at the guns constantly. I missed something. I'm looking for it. Oh, there it is. So these two antagonists are really very evenly matched. They're approximately the same length. They're approximately the same tonnage. They're approximately the same beam and draft. Their propulsion, there are steam engines. The horsepower of the Kearsarge was about 900. That of the Alabama was 600. The armament was very, very similar. They had a crew that was almost the same in number. The Kearsarge had one advantage. This is a picture of one of two 11-inch Dahlgren pivot guns. This is the main battery of the Kearsarge. They weighed 16,000 pounds and required a gun crew of 20 men to maneuver these guns for aiming. They fired solid shot or shells, which weighed 166 pounds and 136 pounds respectively, and had a range of just under 2 miles. So Winslow drilled his men every day because he wanted to be ready. And when he was drilling them, they would often have target practice. They would take a barrel that was empty, put it in the wake of the ship, and then come around and then fire at it so that his gunners could become experienced at firing at targets. Sunday morning, June 19th, 1864. Captain Winslow is reading scripture to the crew, as required by U.S. Navy regulations. When the lookout from the masthead reported that the Alabama was leaving Cherbourg. Now, why is Winslow reading scripture? Because there were no chaplains aboard ships in the Navy during the Civil War. From the time period of 1860 to 1870, only 20 chaplains served in the U.S. Navy, and none of them aboard ship. Makes you wonder, what were they doing? Where were they and what were they doing? So Winslow closes the Bible and calls the crew to quarters. In the meantime, when the Alabama is coming out to fight the Kearsarge, hundreds of French citizens who observed the battle from the heights around Cherbourg could not have known that what they were witnessing was the last naval battle between wooden-hulled ships firing broadsides. The Alabama opened fire at a range of 1,200 yards with a broadside. All the shots were high and none hit the Kearsarge. The Alabama fired 2 more broadsides, but they were also high and none hit the Kearsarge, which held her fire until the range closed to 1,000 yards. For the next hour and a half, the two ships fired at each other at a range of 9 yards in a series of circles. The fire from the Alabama was hurried and poorly aimed. The fire from the Kearsarge was paced and methodical. The Alabama fired 370 shots at the Kearsarge. 28 actually hit the ship. Now, one of those shots hit an 8-inch shell from the Alabama, launched in the stern post of the Kearsarge, but failed to explode. What a fortunate thing that was, because had it exploded, it could have changed the whole outcome of that battle. The Kearsarge fired 173 shots. There's no record how many of this actually hit the Alabama, but apparently enough to do serious damage. Within an hour after the opening, the Alabama started sinking by the stern, with her bow rising sharply as she went down. So all that gunnery and all that drill by Winslow paid off. So on Sunday morning, June 19th, about 11 o'clock, the Alabama starts sinking. This is a post-war drawing on the left that shows the Kearsarge gun crews cheering as the Alabama hauls down her colors. And the Alabama sinks beneath the waves. The final casualties, Alabama, 26 killed or drowned, 3 dying, 17 were wounded and taken prisoners. On the Kearsarge, 50 unharmed prisoners on board the Kearsarge, 42 escaped to Southampton, including Semmes and Kell, the captain and his executive officer. On the Kearsarge, 1 dead and 2 wounded. 17 Kearsarge sailors are recipients of the Medal of Honor, including this man right here, Joaquin Pease, who is an African American. And he is the second Navy sailor in the Civil War to be awarded the Medal of Honor. Now, why were there so many Medal of Honors given on the Kearsarge, and why were there so many Medal of Honors? Well, because it's the only medal the United States government gave soldiers and sailors during the Civil War. It's the only one. So, in modern times, although I'm sure that these sailors performed what they were doing and were so cited by their officers to receive an award, they probably wouldn't get the Medal of Honor now. They'd probably get the Navy Cross, or the Distinguished Service Cross, or something of that nature, but not the Medal of Honor. But even so, it's a pretty remarkable little factoid there about the 17 sailors on the Kearsarge received the Medal of Honor. After the Alabama sank, the Kearsarge entered Sherbrooke Harbor to discharge the prisoners they had recovered. It was swarmed by spectators to see the victors of the fight. French photographer Francois Rodin came on board and took a series of images of the Kearsarge. And one of these is really fascinating because in the front here, you see this really small figure right here. That is 12-year-old Manuel Jose Gallardo, who was 12 years old and shipped aboard the Kearsarge in Algeciras, Spain. This is in clear violation of Navy regulations that says you can't ship somebody or sign somebody on below the age of 14. But in this time period, recruiting officers seldom checked up on their facts about how old who was. They were looking for somebody, and you'll do. So nobody knows what happened to Gallardo. He was there on the ship during the battle, doing his duty. What happened to him afterwards? Did they offload him? Did he come back to Boston with the ship? I don't know. Nobody knows. Here's another photograph that shows the crew of the Kearsarge. This was assembled. Rodin asked them to go to quarters so we get a picture of the crew, the gun crews, at their guns. And these are the 2 pivot guns that I talked about earlier. And this is another one, just shows how big and massive those things were. Various artists also came on board to make sketches that would eventually become paintings. And there have been literally dozens of paintings of the duel between the Kearsarge and the Alabama. And this is probably one of the most famous, was by Edward Manet, the French impressionist, who produced this painting, which is in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. The Kearsarge arrived at Charlestown Navy Yard on November 8, 1864 for repairs. The entire crew were given a hero's welcome, being escorted through the streets of Boston by the Navy Yard Marine Corps Band to Faneuil Hall, where they were treated to a reception. The Alabama claims, this is the legacy of the USS Kearsarge. So if I remember right, I told you to keep in mind the fact that the Alabama was built in England. So this was in clear violation of the Neutrality Acts, which Great Britain had signed at the beginning of the war. During the war, Confederate agents contracted for warships from British shipyards, disguised as merchant vessels during their construction, The craft were originally, they were actually intended as commerce raiders, like the Alabama. This over here is the shipyard of Jonathan Laird on the Mersey River. In addition to the Alabama are the British ships, the Florida, Georgia, Rappahannock, and Shenandoah. Together they sank more than 150 ships and impelled much of the U.S. merchant marine to adopt foreign registry. Protests from the U.S. government persuaded British and French officials to seize additional ships. Most famously, the British government impounded 2 ironclad, steam-driven Laird rams that Confederate agents James D. Bullock had surreptitiously arranged to be built in Liverpool. After years of successful negotiations, a joint commission meeting in Washington arrived at the basis for a settlement. The British government expressed regret, crocodile tears. You have to remember that during the Civil War, England was not our friend. John Bull was not our friend. So this agreement, May 8, 1870, was known as the Treaty of Washington. By the way, Charles Sumner originally asked for $2 billion in damages. Some members of Congress proposed that Great Britain cede all of Canada to the U.S. President Grant sent the Secretary of State, and they worked out an agreement with British representatives. And they met in Geneva, and the room is called the Alabama Room in Geneva, Switzerland, where the arbitration took place in 1872. The final award of $15,500,000 formed part of the Treaty of Washington and was paid out by Great Britain in 1872. How much is $15 million now? $289 million. A cool 1/3 of $1 billion. The legacy of the Alabama claims, and this is really interesting, because this was a precursor to the Hague Convention, the League of Nations, the World Court, and the United Nations. All came out of this arbitration, this international arbitration. Now here we come to the strangest story. And this can only happen in New Hampshire. So, and this whole following sequence here is all from, extracted from The Pride of Portsmouth, which is an article written by William Marble for the New Hampshire Historical Society Spring-Summer issue, 1986. By the way, William Marble is a New Hampshire author. He wrote probably the best account of the fight between the Alabama and the Kearsarge, which is what most of this presentation is based on. So, yeah, so a strange legacy. There were 2 mountains in New Hampshire named Mount Kearsarge. One is in North Conway at 3,268 feet. The other one is in Merrimack County in Warner. That one is 2,937 feet. Now this story starts out at the beginning of the war when Gustavus Fox on the right, his name got obliterated there when he moved things around. And by the way, you can see why the sailors referred to him as Father Neptune. Not to his face. And on the left over there is Gustavus Fox, who was a New Englander, and he was the Undersecretary of the Navy. These two have made a great pair throughout the entire war. They went from 38 ships that existed in the Federal Navy to over 700 4 years later. So, the Navy Department was determined to christen new vessels that they were building with exclusively American names. Hence, a number of Indian names started to appear. So, administration officials and their wives were invited to submit names. There's correspondence between Wells and Fox reveals that Wells asked him to come up with the names for the ships being built at the Portsmouth Navy Yard, including the Kearsarge. So Mrs. Gustavus Fox was the daughter of New Hampshire Senator and Supreme Court Justice Levi Woodbury. And she wished to name a ship the Kearsarge after the 3,268-foot mountain just north of North Conway, where she had summered. For 14 years, there was no question, until along comes Henry McFarland. Everybody totally remember that guy's name? All right? He wrote a letter to Gideon Wells claiming that he had suggested the name, and it was the Mount Kearsarge in Warner. All right. And then, so he went to enlist the aid of the Reverend Nathaniel Booton, president. This guy should have been defrocked, because he did a lot of things that he shouldn't have been doing as a minister. He definitely was a bad guy. According to my opinion, you can form your own opinion afterwards, he was an advocate of the Warner Mountain. And he elicits the aid of several legislators to officially rename the Carroll County mountain Mount Pequawket. How bold is that? You know? In a moment of high drama, Booton was addressing the state legislature on the subject that it was not Mrs. Fox, but when he was interrupted by Albert Hatch, the Speaker of the House, who produced from his pocket a letter written by Gideon Wells in which he defended Fox's claim that since she was a New Hampshire native and was aware that there are two mountains, she certainly knew which mountain she was referring to. So Fox did more finding, even more evidence to support his wife's claim. He's presented the information to the Appalachian Mountain Club and the legislature. The Reverend Booton was irate, and he formed a committee that included Fox, who was stacked with Booton's cronies. Not too surprising, they ignored all of Fox's documentation and determined it was a Merrimack County mountain. Furthermore, they said that Fox had lied to benefit his wife. By 1883, Fox was dead, as was Gideon Wells, but the commission continued its work. Publisher McFarland claimed that Governor Gilmore had indeed suggested the name. However, Gilmore did not become governor until 2 years after Kearsarge was launched and at sea. There's a lot of chicanery going on here. There's some deceit going on here, and there's some fraud going on here. So, finally, the supporters of the mountain in Warner went out, just by attrition, wearing out. And that is the mountain officially recognized as the name of the Kearsarge, for the name of the Kearsarge. What's the Navy say about all this? They're pretty much clueless. They're only going by what New Hampshire tells them, and New Hampshire says, oh, it's one and one. All right, everything to say. So that's basically the story of that. So that's kind of like, and this kind of like summarizes the whole thing. This is Portsmouth Civil War Monument on Islington Street in Portsmouth. And the pride of Portsmouth they talk about, here on that one face of that monument, they pay tribute to the Kearsarge. I like this little poem right here, which is written by English poet Thomas Jordan. Now he lived between 1612 and 1685, so it's been around for a long time. God and our sailors wait our door when danger threatens, and not before. When danger is past and all is right, God has forgotten and the sailor slighted. I'll just close with a Navy hymn composed by William Whiting in 1860. He was actually an Englishman. It was adopted by the American Navy and is sung at every service in the Naval Academy. Now I'll take any questions, but first I want to say this. When I did the talk on the Steamboat Arabia, my wife thought she was done having to prepare food. so really thank her, for doing this, because she jumped in, and did this for us. And but I'll take right now. I'll take any questions you might have from anything I said. Yes.
I want to know how many men were on board, because it looked like there were 20 officers and then hundreds of men, or 100 men.
There were about 30 officers, and there's 163 total, so it was like 140 enlisted men. This is on something that's nothing. The Victory, which was a ship not much longer, actually it was a little bit shorter. It had 3 decks. It had 1,000 men on it. HMS Victory. Yes. Oh,
I seem to remember my history was the Merrimack and the Monitor.
Yeah.
So it's-
Yeah.
oh yeah, that's because the Merrimack was named for our river. But when the Navy Yard in Portsmouth was abandoned and they scuttled all the ships when they left the Navy Yard, the Confederates raised the Merrimack and they cut it all at the water line and they built the ironclad on top of it and renamed it the Virginia.
Nice.
Yeah. So
Part of the ship was built in Nashua, I believe, too.
what?
Nashua, New Hampshire had a part of manufacturing.
Oh yes, yes. Nashua, New Hampshire on that is east. What is the name of that street? Anyway, it was down there. There was No.
Wallace Street?
But anyway, yeah, there was a foundry there that became a hardware store for years and years, and that foundry produced the port stoppers for the Monitor, the first Monitor. They actually built 60. I don't know if you're aware of that, but there was like 60 Monitors built in the Civil War during the Navy by the Navy during the Civil War. The Monitor was the first one. They were all called Monitors after that. Yes, that place in Nashua. Osgood's Hardware, that's what it was, Osgood's Hardware.
Yep.
They used to go in there and the whole building was like beams this big.
Yep.
And they tore it all down and made a parking lot.
No.
Any other questions? Yeah,
Where did the officers learn how to sail a ship like that?
because they went to sea at 10 years old as midshipmen. And
Okay.
so they were required to learn navigation and all the other things that necessary to run a ship. So they were midshipmen, and when they finished their term, they became past midshipmen, right? And then, which I think might actually have been the equivalent to an ensign now, but yeah, so that whole thing gets a little bit strange right there. But yes, and so when the Naval Academy was formed, all of the cadets were midshipmen at the 4 different levels of the classes. And they learned all that stuff at the Naval Academy. Navigation, gunnery, all that stuff. Yeah. Yes.
Just a comment, Osgood's built my parents' summer.
Really?
Yes.
Where was that?
In Dunstable, it's still there. Those of you who know Robin Harley, she's living in that house.
Huh. No kidding. That's an interesting little tidbit of information. Any other questions?
Just a comment. I used to live right next to the monument.
What?
I used to live right next to the.
Oh, monument on Islington
Yeah,
Street?
property ran right up to the park.
Oh, yeah?
So I never knew the story of the Kearsarge, and
Yeah, it's
it's
so.
part of my childhood.
So if I hope you all leave here with an appreciation for the Kearsarge and how important it was for the U.S. Navy in the Civil War and what a significant ship in history it has. So that's my goal. I hope I accomplished that. There's lots of good stuff over there to eat, so go and help yourself.